The flour dust settled on Natalie Abbott's worn apron like fresh snow on the high desert plains of New Mexico territory. And she barely noticed, because her mind was spinning with calculations that refused to add up no matter how many times she worked through them. The year was 1879, and white oaks was growing faster than anybody had predicted when silver was discovered in the nearby mountains, bringing prospectors and cowboys and businessmen from every corner of the country. She had 6 pies cooling on the windowsill of her small kitchen, another 4 in the oven, and 2 more waiting to be assembled, all for the church social that afternoon that Reverend Patterson had organized to raise money for the new schoolhouse. Her mother had been gone 3 years now, taken by fever one brutal winter that Natalie tried not to think about anymore. Her father had followed just 6 months later, his heart giving out while he worked his small ranch on the outskirts of town. At 22 years old, Natalie found herself alone in a world that did not look kindly on unmarried women without family protection. She had sold most of the cattle to pay off her father's debts, keeping the house and a few acres because she could not bear to part with the only home she had ever known. The church socials had become her lifeline. She baked pies and cakes and sold them to earn enough money to keep herself fed and the roof over her head intact. Mrs. Henderson down at the general store let her buy ingredients on credit because Natalie always paid her debts, even if it took a little longer sometimes. The other women in town whispered about her, about how she should remarry, about how unseemly it was for a young woman to live alone. But Natalie held her head high and kept baking because she had learned that survival mattered more than propriety. She pulled the latest batch from the oven, the sweet smell of apples and cinnamon filling her small kitchen. Through the window, she could see the sun climbing higher, reminding her that she had only a few hours before the social began. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, crimping crusts and brushing egg wash over the golden surfaces until they shone. These were not just pies. They were her independence, her dignity, her refusal to become a burden on anyone. By the time she loaded the pies into the back of her small wagon, the sun hung directly overhead, blazing down with that particular intensity unique to New Mexico summers. She had 12 pies total, each one representing hours of work and the last of her carefully hoarded supplies. If they sold well today, she could buy more flour and sugar and maybe even splurge on some decent coffee for herself. If they did not sell, she would have to figure out another way to make it through the next few weeks. The wagon rattled down the dusty main street of White Oaks, past the saloons and the assay office and the new hotel that had just been built to accommodate all the miners flooding into town. Natalie kept her eyes forward, aware of the men who stopped to watch her pass, aware of how vulnerable she was in a town where women were outnumbered 3 to 1. She had learned to project confidence she did not always feel, to meet stares with a level gaze that suggested she was not afraid even when her heart pounded in her chest. The church stood at the far end of town, a simple wooden structure with a bell tower that Reverend Patterson rang every Sunday morning. Today the yard was already filling with people, families spreading blankets on the grass, children running between the adults, women setting up tables laden with food. Natalie guided her wagon to the designated area and began carefully unloading her pies, arranging them on the table that Mrs. Patterson had reserved for baked goods. "Natalie, dear, those look absolutely wonderful," Mrs. Patterson said, appearing at her elbow with that maternal concern that always made Natalie feel about 12 years old. "You have such a gift with pastry." "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. I hope they sell well today." "I am sure they will. Everyone talks about your pies. "You know, my nephew just arrived in town last week. He is working at the Morrison Ranch, and he is a good Christian man. Perhaps I could introduce you." Natalie smiled politely, the way she had learned to smile when well-meaning women tried to marry her off to whatever man happened to be available. "That is very kind of you, but I should really focus on my pies today." She escaped before Mrs. Patterson could press the issue, moving to the far side of the table where she could keep an eye on her wares. The social was already in full swing, with Reverend Patterson making announcements about the schoolhouse fund, and various women competing to see whose dishes attracted the most attention. Natalie had priced her pies at 50 cents a slice, which was steep but fair given the quality of her work. She needed to sell at least half of them to make the afternoon worthwhile. The first hour passed slowly. People browsed the tables, admiring the food but not buying much yet. Natalie tried not to watch too anxiously as potential customers picked up other items, tried not to calculate how little money she had left at home, tried not to think about what would happen if this did not work out. She had become an expert at pushing worry into a small corner of her mind where it could not paralyze her, but sometimes the weight of her situation threatened to crush her anyway. Then he appeared, and everything changed in ways she could not have predicted if she had lived 100 years. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that strained against his work shirt, and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same red rock that dotted the New Mexico landscape. His hat was pulled low, but she could see dark eyes that seemed to take in everything with a sharp intelligence, a strong jaw shadowed with stubble, and hands that looked capable of both hard labor and surprising gentleness. He moved through the crowd with an easy confidence that suggested he was comfortable in his own skin, stopping occasionally to nod at people he knew but clearly heading somewhere with purpose. That somewhere turned out to be her table. "Afternoon, madam," he said, his voice a low rumble that did something strange to her insides. "Those your pies, they are." Natalie straightened her shoulders, slipping into the role of businesswoman that she wore like armor. "Apple, cherry, peach, and pecan. 50 cents a slice, or $3 for a whole pie." He studied the display with the same intensity she imagined he brought to evaluating horses or judging the weather. "You make them yourself, everyone, this morning. You are Natalie Abbott, right? You live in that little house on the east side of town." Wariness crept up her spine. In her experience, when strange men knew who she was and where she lived, it rarely led anywhere good. "I am, and you are, James Everett. I work for the Morrison Ranch, been there about 8 months now. I have heard people talk about your baking." He met her eyes directly, and she was struck by the honesty she saw there, none of the calculation or hunger that usually lurked in men's gazes when they looked at young, unmarried women. "I would like to buy a slice of each kind." "See what all the fuss is about." Natalie blinked. 4 slices would be $2 more than she usually made in an entire social. "Of course. Let me get you a plate." She cut generous slices, aware of his eyes on her as she worked, aware of how her hands trembled slightly as she arranged them on the tin plate. When she handed it to him, their fingers brushed, and she felt a jolt of something she had not felt in longer than she could remember. Attraction, maybe, or recognition, as if some part of her knew him even though they had never met. He paid her with silver coins that clinked solidly when they hit her hand, then moved to a nearby bench where he could sit. Natalie tried to focus on other potential customers, but her attention kept drifting back to James Everett as he methodically worked through each slice of pie, taking his time, clearly savoring every bite. She told herself it was just professional interest, wanting to know if her work satisfied a customer, but she knew she was lying to herself. When he finished, He returned to her table, and she noticed several other people watching with interest now. "Madam, I have eaten pie in 4 territories and 2 states, and I can honestly say those are the best I have ever tasted." Heat flooded her cheeks. "That is very kind of you to say." "Not kind, true." He pulled out his wallet again, and her eyes widened when she saw the bills inside. Cowboys did not usually carry that kind of money unless they had just been paid or were particularly good at saving. "How many pies you got left?" 11 whole pies, and what is left of the one I have been slicing?" "I will take them all." The words hung in the air between them, and Natalie was certain she had misheard. "I am sorry, what? All of them. I will buy every pie you have got here. That would be $33 if my arithmetic is right." $33. That was more than she usually made in 2 months. That was enough to buy supplies and pay Mrs. Henderson what she owed and still have money left over. That was impossible, too good to be true, and her mind immediately started searching for the trap, because men did not just give women that kind of money without expecting something in return. "Mr. Everett, that is very generous, but I cannot accept. These pies are meant for the social, to raise money for the schoolhouse. And I am raising money for the schoolhouse by buying them. That is how this works, is it not?" His expression was mild, but she caught a glint of humor in his dark eyes. "Unless there is some rule that says I cannot buy them all." Mrs. Patterson had materialized beside them, her face lit with delight. "Mr. Everett, how wonderful! This is exactly the kind of community spirit we hope to see today. Natalie, dear, you should accept. This is marvelous." Natalie looked between them, her mind spinning. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong, that she should not take his money, that there had to be some ulterior motive. But $33 would change everything for her. It would mean security for months, would mean not lying awake at night wondering how she would survive. "Mr. Everett, might I ask why you want to buy all my pies?" He met her gaze steadily. "Because they are the best pies I have ever eaten, and because you clearly need the money, and because the schoolhouse needs funding. Seems like everybody wins." The bluntness should have offended her, but instead she found it oddly refreshing. So many people in town tiptoed around her situation, pretending they did not notice her worn dresses or her too thin frame or the way she made a single meal stretch across 2 days. He was acknowledging reality without judgment, and that was almost more unsettling than if he had tried to charm her. "I will pay you for them on one condition," James continued. "You let me take you to supper sometime. Nothing improper. Just a meal at the hotel restaurant in full view of everyone so we can talk like civilized people." There it was, the catch she had been waiting for. Except it was not really a catch, was it? He was not propositioning her or making crude suggestions. He was asking to take her to dinner, something that happened between men and women all the time in White Oaks. And yet her heart raced because she knew what dinner would mean, what it would look like to everyone watching. It would look like courtship. "Miss Abbott does not have to agree to anything beyond this transaction," Reverend Patterson said firmly, appearing on her other side. Natalie had not even noticed his approach. "Mr. Everett, we appreciate your generosity, but this young lady is not obligated to you in any way." James turned to face the Reverend, and Natalie saw something shift in his posture, a subtle stiffening that suggested offense. "Reverend, I meant no disrespect. I was asking Miss Abbott if she would have dinner with me, not demanding it as payment for pies. She can say no. The $33 is hers either way." He pulled the money from his wallet and set it on the table, the bills crisp and clean. Then he looked at Natalie, and she saw vulnerability flash across his face for just a moment before his expression went neutral again. "I apologize if I overstepped, Miss Abbott. That was not my intention. The pies are bought and paid for. Whatever you decide about dinner is entirely your choice." He tipped his hat to her and walked away before she could respond, moving back through the crowd with those long, confident strides. Natalie stared at the money on her table, at the pies that were now sold, at the future that had just opened up in ways she had not imagined this morning. "Well, Mrs. Patterson said, sounding slightly dazed. "That was quite something." "Indeed," Reverend Patterson agreed. "Natalie, you know you do not have to do anything you are uncomfortable with. Mr. Everett seems like a decent man, but you should not feel pressured." "I do not feel pressured," Natalie said slowly, surprised to find it was true. He was very clear that the money was mine regardless. She picked up the bills, fanning them out to confirm they were real. $33, more money than she had held at once since her father died. Enough to change everything. And all because a cowboy named James Everett had walked up to her table and decided her pies were worth buying. The rest of the social passed in a blur. People came by to congratulate her on such a good sale, and she smiled and thanked them while her mind raced. Several women made pointed comments about James, about how he was a good worker, how he saved his money instead of drinking it away like so many cowboys did, how he attended church most Sundays, even though he sat in the back and left immediately after the service ended. Natalie absorbed all this information, filing it away, trying to understand who this man was who had just upended her afternoon. When she finally loaded her empty pie tins back into the wagon and prepared to head home, she found herself scanning the crowd for James. She did not see him anywhere. He had left after buying the pies, presumably returning to the Morrison Ranch or wherever else he spent his Saturday afternoons. She told herself the disappointment she felt was ridiculous. He was just a customer. The fact that he had also asked her to dinner meant nothing. Except it did mean something, and she knew it. The ride back to her small house gave her time to think. The money was safely tucked into the pocket she had sewn into her dress specifically for carrying cash, and she kept touching it to make sure it was still there. When she reached home, she unhitched the wagon and tended to her horse, then carried the pie tins inside and stood in the middle of her kitchen trying to decide what to do next. The smart thing would be to take the money and forget about James Everett. She could buy supplies, pay her debts, and keep living the way she had been living. Safe, solitary, surviving but not really thriving. The other option was more dangerous, more uncertain. But as she stood there in her empty kitchen with the afternoon sun slanting through the windows, Natalie realized she was tired of being afraid all the time. She had been alone for 3 years. She had managed, had survived, had kept herself fed and housed through sheer determination and hard work. But survival was not the same as living, and she had almost forgotten what it felt like to want something beyond just making it to the next day. Maybe it was time to take a risk. The decision made, Natalie changed out of her good dress and into her work clothes, then headed into town on foot. The Morrison Ranch was about 5 miles south of White Oaks, too far to walk before dark, but she knew where the ranch hands came when they had time off. Sure enough, when she pushed through the doors of the Silver Dollar Saloon, she spotted James sitting at a corner table nursing a beer and playing cards with 3 other men. The conversation died when she entered. Women did not usually come into saloons, at least not the kind of women who attended church socials. Natalie felt every eye in the room turn toward her, felt the weight of judgment and speculation and curiosity. She ignored all of it and walked straight to James's table. He looked up, surprise clear on his face. "Miss Abbott, Mr. Everett, I was hoping I could speak with you for a moment." He stood immediately, gathering his cards and laying them face down on the table. "Of course. Let me just settle up here." One of the other cowboys, a heavy-set man with a gray beard, shook his head. Keep your seat, Everett. We will count you out for this hand. He looked at Natalie with open curiosity. Madam, thank you, she said, though she was not entirely sure what she was thanking him for. James led her outside, away from the prying eyes and listening ears, stopping on the wooden sidewalk that ran in front of the saloon. The late afternoon sun painted everything gold, and dust motes danced in the air between them. Is everything all right? James asked. Did something happen? Everything is fine. I just wanted to give you my answer about dinner. His expression shifted, hope and wariness mixing together. You did not have to come all the way into town for that. You could have sent word. I know, but I wanted to tell you in person. She took a breath, gathering her courage. Yes, 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 I will have dinner with you, if the invitation still stands. The smile that spread across his face transformed him. He went from handsome to devastating in the space of a heartbeat, and Natalie felt her stomach flip. The invitation absolutely still stands. When would be good for you? Tomorrow evening. After church? Tomorrow evening is perfect. I will come by your house around 6 if that works. We can walk to the hotel together. That works. She should leave now, should turn and walk away, but she found herself rooted to the spot. Mr. Everett, can I ask you something? James. Please call me James. And yes, you can ask me anything. Why did you really buy all those pies? He considered the question, his dark eyes serious. I told you the truth. They were the best pies I had ever tasted, but I will admit that was not the only reason. What was the other reason? Because I have been watching you around town for months now, trying to work up the courage to introduce myself. You always looked so determined, so focused on whatever you were doing, and I figured you did not have time for some cowboy trying to make conversation. But then I saw you at the social today, and I thought maybe this was my chance. So I bought the pies and I asked you to dinner, and now here we are. The honesty in his voice made her chest tight. You have been watching me for months. Not in a creepy way. I hope it does not sound like that. I just noticed you. The way you hold your head up even when people whisper. The way you work harder than anyone else I have seen. The way you are still kind even though life has not been particularly kind to you. He ran a hand through his hair, looking suddenly self-conscious. I am not very good at this. What I am trying to say is that I admire you, and I wanted to know you better, and buying 12 pies seemed like a reasonable way to get your attention. Natalie laughed, surprised by the sound of her own amusement. That is definitely one way to get someone's attention. Did it work? I am here, am I not? You are indeed. His smile returned, softer this time. I will see you tomorrow evening, Miss Abbott. Natalie. If I am calling you James, you should call me Natalie. Natalie. He said her name carefully, like he was tasting it. I like that. I will see you tomorrow, Natalie. She walked back to her house as the sun began to set, her mind full of James Everett and his honest eyes and his ridiculous gesture with the pies. When she got home, she sat at her small kitchen table and counted out the money he had given her, organizing it into neat piles. Then she made a list of everything she needed to buy, everything she owed, and everything she could save. For the first time in longer than she could remember, her budget actually balanced with money to spare. That night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling and trying not to think about tomorrow. Trying not to imagine what it would be like to sit across from James at dinner, to talk with him, to learn about who he was beyond a cowboy who bought pies. She had been alone so long that the prospect of letting someone into her life felt both thrilling and terrifying. But she had already said yes, and Natalie Abbott never went back on her word. The next morning, she attended church service as usual, sitting in her regular pew near the back. She tried to focus on Reverend Patterson's sermon about kindness and charity, but her attention kept drifting to the door, wondering if James would show up. He did, slipping in just as the service started and taking a seat in the very last row. Their eyes met once across the church, and he gave her a small nod that she returned. After the service, several women cornered her outside the church, all of them wanting to talk about what had happened at the social. Mrs. Patterson was particularly enthusiastic, going on about how wonderful it was that Natalie had found such a generous buyer for her pies, and was it not convenient that he happened to be single and hardworking and relatively good-looking for a cowboy. Natalie deflected their questions as politely as she could, then escaped to her wagon before anyone could interrogate her further. The rest of the day passed slowly. She cleaned her already clean house, tried on 3 different dresses before settling on the dark blue one that her mother had made years ago, and attempted to tame her hair into something presentable. By the time 6 o'clock approached, her nerves were stretched so tight she thought she might snap. When the knock came at her door, she jumped. Then she took a deep breath, smoothed her dress one more time, and opened it. James stood on her small porch, hat in hand, wearing clean clothes and a nervous expression that made him look younger than his years. "Evening, Natalie." "Evening, James." "Let me just get my shawl." She grabbed the worn shawl from its hook by the door, and they began the walk into town. The evening was beautiful, warm but not hot, with a breeze that carried the scent of sage and dust. For the first few minutes, neither of them spoke, and the silence felt heavy with expectation. Finally, James cleared his throat. "You look very nice." "Thank you, so do you." More silence. Then they both started talking at the same time. "I should tell you I wanted to say." They stopped, and Natalie laughed. "You first." "I just wanted to say that I am glad you agreed to this. I was not sure you would." "I was not sure I would either," she admitted, "but I decided it was time to take a chance. On me, on myself mostly. But yes, on you too." They reached the hotel as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The restaurant was on the first floor, a relatively nice establishment by White Oak standards, with actual tablecloths and menus written on a chalkboard. James held the door for her, and they were seated at a table near the window where they could watch the street. Natalie had eaten at the hotel restaurant exactly once, shortly after her father died, when she needed to meet with the banker to discuss her debts. She had ordered the cheapest thing on the menu and barely tasted it, too anxious about her financial situation to enjoy the food. Tonight was different. Tonight she was here with James, and when the waiter came to take their order, James told her to get whatever she wanted without even looking at the prices. They ordered pot roast and potatoes, and while they waited for the food, James started asking her questions. Where had she grown up? Right here in White Oaks, in the same house she still lived in. What had her parents been like? Her mother had been gentle and patient, teaching her everything she knew about baking. Her father had been stern but kind, working himself to exhaustion trying to make the ranch successful. "That must have been hard, losing them both so close together," James said quietly. "It was. It still is sometimes." Natalie took a sip of water, surprised by how easy it was to talk to him. "What about you? Where are you from?" "Texas originally, near Fort Worth." "My family had a small ranch there, but there were too many of us trying to make a living off too little land. I left when I was 18, worked my way north, took jobs wherever I could find them. Ended up here about 8 months ago when Mr. Morrison hired me on." "Do you miss Texas?" "Sometimes. I miss my family, but I do not miss feeling like I was in the way all the time, like there was not enough room for everyone's dreams." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant. "I want to have my own place someday. Nothing huge, just enough land to run a small herd, maybe grow some crops. Somewhere I can build something that is mine." The food arrived then, steaming and fragrant, and they both ate with the appetite of people who worked hard for their living. Natalie could not remember the last time she had eaten a meal this substantial, and she had to force herself not to devour it like she was starving. Between bites, they continued talking, the conversation flowing more easily as the evening progressed. James told her about working on the Morrison ranch, about the other cowboys he bunked with, about the time he helped deliver a breech calf in the middle of a thunderstorm. Natalie told him about learning to bake from her mother, about the church socials that had become her main source of income, about the constant struggle to keep her house and her independence. "You should not have to work so hard just to survive," James said, his voice rough with something that might have been anger or frustration. "It is not right. Maybe not, but it is reality." Natalie met his eyes. "I am not looking for pity, James. I am managing." "I know you are. That is one of the things I admire about you. You do not give up." He reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of touching hers. "But maybe you do not have to manage alone." Her heart stuttered. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I would like to keep seeing you. If you want that too. I am saying that maybe we could help each other. I know we just met, really, but I feel like I have been waiting to meet you for a long time." Natalie looked at his hand, so close to hers on the table, and thought about how easy it would be to close that distance. How easy and how dangerous, because letting someone in meant risking her heart, meant opening herself up to the possibility of loss again. She had built walls around herself for good reasons, and those walls had kept her safe even if they had also kept her lonely. But James was offering something she had not realized she wanted so badly: connection, partnership, the chance to be more than just a woman struggling to survive. She reached out and placed her hand over his, feeling the calluses on his palm, the warmth of his skin. "I would like that too." His smile was blinding. "Yeah. Yeah." They finished dinner in a warm haze of new understanding, talking about everything and nothing, learning each other in the way new people do. When the meal was done and James paid the bill with money he clearly did not spend lightly, they walked back to her house through the gathering darkness. The stars were beginning to appear overhead, more stars than seemed possible, scattered across the sky like sugar on a pie crust. At her door, James stopped and turned to face her. "I had a really good time tonight, Natalie. So did I. Can I see you again? Maybe next Saturday? I would like that. I usually bake on Saturdays, but I could take a break, or I could come by and watch you bake. If you would not mind the company." The offer surprised her, but pleasantly. "You want to watch me bake? I want to spend time with you. I do not care what we are doing." He hesitated, then added, "And I really do love your pies." She laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "All right. Come by on Saturday around noon. I will put you to work peeling apples." "I would be honored to peel apples for you." He left then, walking back toward the Morrison ranch even though it was dark and the road was long. Natalie watched him go, then went inside and leaned against her closed door, her hand pressed to her chest where her heart was racing. She felt like a girl again, young and full of possibility, and it was both wonderful and terrifying. The week that followed was one of the longest of her life. She went about her normal routine, buying supplies at the general store with some of the money James had given her, settling her account with Mrs. Henderson, baking bread and doing laundry and all the mundane tasks that filled her days. But through it all, she thought about James, about the way he had looked at her across the dinner table, about the warmth of his hand under hers, about the promise of Saturday. When Saturday finally arrived, she woke early and cleaned her kitchen until it gleamed. She laid out all her baking supplies, started the fire in her stove, and tried not to watch the clock on her mantel. Noon felt like it was years away instead of hours. When the knock came at her door at precisely 12 o'clock, She had to stop herself from running to answer it. James stood there with a sheepish grin, holding a basket covered with a cloth. "I brought apples," he said. "Figured if I was going to peel them, I might as well contribute." She invited him in, and for a moment they both just stood in her small kitchen, the intimacy of the space suddenly apparent. This was her private domain, the place where she created the pies that kept her alive, and having him here felt significant in ways she could not quite articulate. "So," James said, breaking the silence, "what do I do first?" She put him to work peeling apples while she mixed the dough for the crusts, and they fell into an easy rhythm. James was not particularly skilled with a paring knife, and he cut the peels off in thick chunks that wasted some of the fruit, but he was cheerful about it and did not complain. They talked while they worked, continuing the conversation they had started at dinner, building on the foundation they had laid. "Can I ask you something personal?" James said after a while. "I suppose that depends on how personal. Why have you not remarried?" "I know it is not my business, but every woman in town has been telling me I should not get my hopes up because you have turned down every man who has asked in the past 3 years. Natalie paused in her work, her hand stilled in the bowl of flour. "I have not remarried because none of them wanted to marry me. They wanted to own me. There is a difference." "What do you mean?" "I mean that every man who has proposed wanted me to give up my house, give up my independence, become a wife who stayed home and did not have thoughts of her own. They saw me as a problem to be solved, not a person to be partnered with." She looked at him directly. "I would rather be alone than be owned." James nodded slowly. "That makes sense. For what it is worth, I do not want to own you. What do you want, honestly?" "I want to build something with you. I want a partner, someone who works beside me instead of behind me. I want to wake up every morning knowing that there is someone in the world who sees me for who I really am." He set down the apple he was peeling and met her eyes. "I know it is too soon to talk about this. We barely know each other. But I believe in being honest about what I want, and what I want is you. Not some version of you that fits what I think a wife should be, just you, exactly as you are." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Natalie's hands trembled slightly as she went back to mixing her dough, trying to process what he had just said. She had known men who were charming, men who said pretty things to get what they wanted. But James did not sound like he was trying to charm her. He sounded serious and maybe a little scared, like he was laying his heart on the table and hoping she would not crush it. "I do not know how to do this," she admitted quietly. "I have been alone so long, I do not know how to let someone in. Then we will figure it out together. No rush. We can take all the time you need." They finished preparing the pies in comfortable silence, and when the first batch went into the oven, James helped her clean up. He washed dishes while she dried, and the domesticity of it felt strange and wonderful. When everything was clean and the pies were baking, filling the kitchen with their sweet scent, Natalie made coffee and they sat at her small table. "Tell me about Texas," she said. "About your family." So he did. He told her about his parents, who were still working their small ranch with the help of his younger brothers. He told her about his sister, who had married a shopkeeper and moved to Dallas. He told her about learning to ride before he could walk, about cattle drives and late nights and the particular kind of exhaustion that came from working the land. "Do you miss it?" Natalie asked. "Sometimes, but I do not think I would go back. There is something about New Mexico that feels right to me, like I am supposed to be here." "I know what you mean. I have never left White Oaks, but I cannot imagine being anywhere else. This is home." The afternoon passed quickly, and when the pies were done and cooling on her windowsill, James reluctantly said he needed to get back to the ranch. He had chores to do, and Mr. Morrison did not appreciate his hands disappearing for too long on their days off. "Thank you for letting me invade your kitchen," he said at the door. "Thank you for peeling apples. Even if you did waste half of them," he laughed. "I will practice. Next time I will be more efficient. Next time, if you will have me back. I would like to make this a regular thing, if that is all right with you. Saturday afternoons, helping you bake." Natalie considered it. Having James here once a week would mean restructuring her routine, making space in her life for another person. It would mean risk and vulnerability and all the things she had been avoiding. But it would also mean companionship and laughter and the particular joy that came from sharing work with someone who did not see it as beneath them. "I would like that," she said, and so it began. Every Saturday afternoon, James showed up at her door with apples or flour or sugar, whatever he could contribute to her baking. They worked side by side in her kitchen, talking and laughing and slowly getting to know each other in the deepest ways. He told her about his dreams of owning land, and she told him about the nightmares she still had about her parents dying. He taught her to whistle, and she taught him to properly crimp a pie crust. They learned each other's rhythms and habits and preferences, building something that felt solid even though it had only been a few weeks. On their fourth Saturday together, James arrived with flowers, wildflowers he had picked on his ride into town. Natalie put them in a jar on her table, and every time she looked at them over the next few days, she felt something warm bloom in her chest. On their sixth Saturday, it rained. A rare hard rain that turned the roads to mud and kept most people inside. James showed up anyway, soaked to the bone, and Natalie made him change into one of her father's old shirts while his clothes dried by the fire. They spent the afternoon playing cards and talking, and when he left, she realized she had not thought about money or survival or any of her usual worries for hours. On their eighth Saturday, he kissed her. They had just finished baking and were standing by her window watching the sunset when he turned to her and said, "Natalie, I need to tell you something. All right. I am falling in love with you. I probably should wait longer to say it, should be more cautious, but I do not see the point in pretending. I love the way you concentrate when you are working. I love how you do not give up even when things are hard. I love your laugh and your stubbornness and the way you cut apples into perfect slices. I just love you and I needed you to know." Her heart felt too big for her chest. "James, you do not have to say anything back. I just wanted to be honest about how I feel." But she did want to say something back because she had been feeling the same way and trying not to admit it, even to herself. "I love you too." His eyes widened. "You do." "I do. I have been trying not to because it scared me, but I do." He reached up and cupped her face in his rough, calloused hands, his touch infinitely gentle. "Can I kiss you?" "Yes." He kissed her then, soft and sweet, like she was something precious that might break if handled roughly. Natalie melted into it, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, anchoring herself to him. When they finally pulled apart, she was breathless and dizzy and happier than she had been in years. "Well," James said, his voice rough, "that was even better than your pies." She laughed and kissed him again, and for the first time since her parents died, Natalie felt like maybe everything was going to be all right. But of course, nothing was ever that simple. The trouble started 3 weeks later when Samuel Morrison, James's employer, came into town for supplies. Natalie was at the general store buying flour when she overheard him talking to Mrs. Henderson. "That Everett boy has been distracted lately. Missing work, showing up late. I am about at the end of my patience with him." Mrs. Henderson, always ready to gossip, said, "I hear he has been spending time with Natalie Abbott. Maybe that is where his attention has gone." "The Abbott girl, the one with the pies," Morrison snorted. "Well, that explains it. Nothing makes a man stupid faster than a pretty face." I will have to have a talk with him." Natalie left the store without buying her flour, her stomach churning. She had known that their courtship might cause problems, but she had not realized it was affecting James's work. That night, she lay awake worrying, and on Saturday when James showed up at her door, she told him they needed to talk. "Mr. Morrison is upset with you because of me," she said without preamble. "I heard him in town. He says you have been distracted." James's jaw tightened. "He has been riding me harder than usual lately, that is true, but it is not your fault. It is my fault if you are missing work to come see me." "I am not missing work. I have been taking my half-day on Saturdays like I always do. What Morrison does not like is that I am not available to work extra hours anymore. He has gotten used to me picking up slack for other men, and now that I am not doing that, he is annoyed. James, you cannot lose your job over me." "I am not going to lose my job. And even if I did, it would not be over you. It would be because Morrison is a demanding boss who thinks his employees should have no life outside of work." He took her hands. "Natalie, I know you are worried, but you do not need to be. I can handle Morrison." But it turned out that James was wrong about being able to handle Morrison. 2 weeks later, he showed up at Natalie's house on a Wednesday evening, his face grim. "He let me go," James said without preamble. "Morrison fired me this afternoon." Natalie felt like she had been punched in the stomach. "What? Why?" He said I was not showing proper dedication to the ranch, that I was more interested in courting than in working. He gave me a week's pay and told me to clear out. James ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. "I knew he was unhappy, but I did not think he would actually fire me. This is my fault." "No, it is not. This is Morrison being controlling and unreasonable. Other men on the ranch have wives and families, and he does not give them grief about it. But they are married. We are just courting." "Exactly, which means Morrison has no right to comment on my personal life." James paced her small kitchen. "I will find another job. There are other ranches, other opportunities." But finding another job proved harder than either of them expected. Word spread quickly in a town the size of White Oaks, and Morrison had connections with most of the other ranchers in the area. When James applied for positions, he was met with polite refusals or outright dismissals. Within 2 weeks, it became clear that Morrison had effectively blackballed him from working on any of the local ranches. Natalie watched James grow increasingly frustrated and angry, watched him spend his days searching for work that did not exist, and felt guilt eat away at her. If she had just stayed alone, if she had not let him into her life, he would still have his job. He would still have a future. "I should not have said yes to dinner that first day," she said one evening when they sat on her porch watching the sun set. "I should have known it would cause problems." "Do not say that." James's voice was sharp. "Do not you dare regret what we have." "How can I not? You lost your job because of me." "I lost my job because Morrison is a petty tyrant who could not stand that I had something in my life more important than his ranch." He took her hand, his grip firm. "Natalie, I would make the same choice 100 times over. You are worth more to me than any job. But you need work. You need money. How are you going to save for that land you want if you are not working?" "I will figure something out. I always do." But weeks passed and James did not find work. Natalie watched him use up his savings, watched the lines of worry deepen around his eyes, watched him try to hide his frustration when he showed up at her house every Saturday. She tried to help, offering to share what little she had, but he refused to take money from her. "You need every penny you make," he said. "I will not take food out of your mouth. Then let me help you some other way. I can bake more, sell more pies." "Natalie, you are already working yourself to exhaustion. I will not ask you to work harder for my sake." They argued about it, their first real fight, and it left both of them shaken. That night, Natalie lay in bed and wondered if loving someone always meant fighting about who got to sacrifice what for whom. She had been alone for so long that she had forgotten how complicated it was to care about another person, to have their well-being tied up with your own. The solution, when it came, was unexpected. Reverend Patterson showed up at her door on a Tuesday afternoon, his usual jovial expression replaced by something more serious. "Natalie, do you have a few minutes to talk?" "Of course, Reverend. Come in." He sat at her kitchen table, accepting the coffee she offered, and looked at her with kind eyes. "I wanted to talk to you about James Everett." Her stomach dropped. "If this is about his character or our courtship, it is not. I think James is a fine young man, and I am happy to see you finding happiness. What I wanted to talk to you about is his employment situation, or lack thereof. Oh, I have been hearing things around town about how Morrison fired him and has been making it difficult for him to find other work. I think that is unconscionable, and I would like to help if I can." Natalie felt tears prick her eyes. "That is very kind of you, Reverend, but I do not know what you could do. Morrison has a lot of influence, perhaps, but I have some influence as well. And I have been thinking about our new schoolhouse. We have the building nearly finished, but we need furniture. Desks, benches, shelves for books. I was planning to order them from Santa Fe, but it occurred to me that we might be able to find someone local who could build them. Someone who could use the work." Understanding dawned. "James can build things. He told me his father taught him carpentry. I thought he might have that skill. Cowboys often do, having to repair things on the ranch. Would you ask him if he would be interested? The pay would not be much, but it would be something. And if he does good work, there are always other projects that need doing. The church needs new pews. Mrs. Patterson wants a new cabinet for the kitchen. There is work out there if he is willing to do it." "Reverend Patterson, I do not know how to thank you." "No need for thanks. This is what a community does. We help each other." He stood, preparing to leave. "Have James come by the church sometime this week. We can discuss details." When Natalie told James about the Reverend's offer, she saw hope light his face for the first time in weeks. He went to talk to Reverend Patterson the next day, and they came to an arrangement. James would build all the furniture for the schoolhouse in exchange for a fair wage and the use of the church's workshop. It was not the same as being a cowboy, but it was honest work that paid, and that was all that mattered. James threw himself into the carpentry with the same dedication he had brought to ranch work. Natalie would stop by the church sometimes to watch him work, marveling at the way his hands shaped wood into useful things, at the focus and skill he brought to each piece. He seemed happier than she had seen him in weeks, and when people saw the quality of his work, they started approaching him with their own projects. Within a month, James had more work than he could handle. He rented a small space in town to use as a proper workshop and started advertising his services. People from surrounding areas heard about the carpenter in White Oaks who did excellent work for fair prices. And suddenly, James had customers coming from miles away. "I think I might actually make more money doing this than I ever did as a cowboy," he told Natalie one Saturday as they sat on her porch after a day of baking. "Morrison might have done me a favor by firing me." "I am glad something good came out of it," Natalie said, "though I still feel guilty." "Do not. None of this was your fault, and look where we ended up. I have work I love, you have your baking, and we have each other. That is more than I ever dared hope for." He kissed her then, and Natalie thought maybe he was right. Maybe sometimes the hardest moments led to the best outcomes. As fall turned to winter, their courtship deepened into something that felt inevitable. They spent every free moment together, learning each other's hopes and fears and dreams. James talked about wanting a small piece of land where he could build a house with his own hands, somewhere they could grow old together. Natalie talked about wanting to expand her baking, maybe even opening a small bakery someday where she could sell bread and pies to regular customers. On Christmas Eve, James asked her to marry him. They were at the church social, the same place where everything had started 6 months earlier. Natalie had baked a dozen pies again, and James had helped her carry them to the church. After they set up her table, he led her outside where they could have some privacy. "I have been thinking about when to do this," he said, reaching into his pocket. "I wanted it to be special, wanted to plan something elaborate. But then I realized that nothing I planned could be more special than this. The place where we met. The reason we started talking. This is where our story began, and I hope it is where we can start the next chapter." He pulled out a simple gold ring, nothing fancy but clearly chosen with care. "Natalie Abbott, I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person. You make me better. You make me want to be better. Will you marry me?" Natalie looked at the ring, at James's hopeful face, at the church behind them where they had first spoken 6 months ago. She thought about how far they had come, about all the obstacles they had overcome, about the life they could build together. "Yes," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly. Then he kissed her, right there in the churchyard where anyone could see. And Natalie did not care who was watching because she was too happy to care about propriety. They were married in late January of 1880, on a cold, clear day when the sun turned the desert landscape into something magical. Reverend Patterson performed the ceremony, and it seemed like the entire town turned out to witness it. Mrs. Patterson cried through the whole service. James's family came up from Texas, and Natalie finally got to meet the people he had told her so much about. His mother hugged her tight and whispered, "Thank you for making my son so happy." The reception was held at the church, and Natalie provided pies for everyone, 12 different kinds that she and James had spent the previous week baking together. When it came time to cut the first slice, James looked at her with such love that she thought her heart might burst. "This is where it all started," he said quietly, for her ears only. "With your pies. And you buying every single one. Best investment I ever made." They spent their wedding night in the small house that had once been just Natalie's but now belonged to both of them. James carried her over the threshold, both of them laughing at the traditional gesture, and then they were alone together for the first time as husband and wife. "I have been thinking," James said as they sat together on the bed that had once seemed so solitary, "about the future." "What about it?" "I have been saving money from my carpentry work. Between that and what you make from baking, we have enough to buy some land. Not a lot, but enough to start. We could build our own house, have a real workshop for me, maybe even a dedicated kitchen for your baking. What do you think?" Natalie thought about leaving the house where she had grown up, and was surprised to find she was ready. This house held memories, both good and painful, but it was time to make new memories somewhere else, somewhere that belonged to both of them from the start. "I think that sounds perfect." They found land just east of White Oaks, 10 acres with a small stream running through it and good soil for growing vegetables. It was not much, but it was theirs. James designed the house himself, incorporating everything they had talked about wanting. A large kitchen for Natalie with plenty of counter space and a good stove. A workshop for James with room for all his tools and materials. A bedroom with big windows to let in the morning light. A porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset. He built it over the course of 6 months, working on it whenever he had time between carpentry jobs. Natalie helped as much as she could, learning basic construction skills and discovering she enjoyed the physical labor of building something from nothing. Other people from town came out to help too, organizing barn-raising style days where everyone contributed. It was humbling to see how the community came together to support them, especially after the difficult start with Morrison. They moved into the house in late summer, and Natalie cried when she walked through the front door for the first time as a resident rather than a visitor. Everything was exactly as they had planned, every detail reflecting their shared dreams and individual needs. "Welcome home," James said, wrapping his arms around her from behind as they stood in their new kitchen. "Welcome home," she echoed, leaning back against his solid warmth. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. James took carpentry jobs and slowly began acquiring livestock, starting with a few chickens and then adding a milk cow. Natalie expanded her baking business, taking orders from people all over White Oaks and the surrounding areas. She became known for her pies, yes, but also for her bread and cakes and cookies. The kitchen James had built for her was perfect for the work, and she found joy in creating food that brought people pleasure. They had their first child in 1881, a son they named Matthew after James's father. Natalie labored through a hot August night, with James holding her hand and Mrs. Patterson serving as midwife. When Matthew finally arrived, small and red and screaming with impressive lung power, James cried as he held his son for the first time. "He is perfect," James whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You are perfect, thank you." Natalie, exhausted and overwhelmed and more in love than ever, could only smile. Matthew was followed by a daughter 2 years later, Elizabeth, named after Natalie's mother. Then came another son, Joshua, and finally another daughter, Sarah. Their house, which had seemed so spacious when it was just the two of them, became filled with the chaos and joy of children. Natalie learned to bake with babies strapped to her back, learned to function on less sleep than she thought humanly possible, learned that love could expand infinitely to encompass however many people needed it. James was a wonderful father, patient and playful, teaching the children to work with wood as soon as they were old enough to hold tools safely. Natalie taught them to bake, passing on the skills her mother had taught her. Their home became a place of laughter and learning, of hard work and harder won rest, of love built day by day through 1,000 small choices and gestures. The years passed, marked by the rhythms of the seasons and the milestones of their children's lives. Matthew grew tall and serious, inheriting his father's skill with carpentry. Elizabeth had her mother's way with baking and her father's stubborn determination. Joshua was the dreamer, always asking questions about how things worked. Sarah, the youngest, had boundless energy and a laugh that could lift the darkest mood. As the children grew, Natalie and James's businesses grew as well. James's carpentry workshop expanded, and he eventually took on an apprentice, a young man from town who showed promise with woodworking. Natalie opened a small bakery in White Oaks, a modest storefront where she sold her goods directly to customers. It meant long days and constant work, but she loved it. She loved being able to provide for her family, loved seeing people's faces light up when they tasted her food, loved knowing that she had built something lasting. On their 10th wedding anniversary, James took her back to the church where they had met. It was another social, another fundraiser, this time to repair the church roof. Natalie had provided pies, as she always did, but this time she had help. Elizabeth and Matthew had both contributed pies of their own, learning skills from their mother. "You remember?" James asked as they stood together near the table where she had first displayed her wares. "How could I forget? You walked up and bought every pie I had." 12 pies, $33, the best money I ever spent. You were ridiculous. I was determined. There is a difference. He pulled her close, right there in front of everyone, and kissed her forehead. I would do it again, you know. If I could go back to that day, knowing everything that would happen, I would still buy every pie. I would still ask you to dinner. I would still fall in love with you. Even knowing how hard it would be. The firing, the struggling to find work, all of it, especially knowing that, because the hard times made us stronger. They proved that what we had was real and worth fighting for. He cupped her face in his hands, those familiar calloused hands that had built their house and held their children and worked alongside her through 10 years of marriage. Natalie Everett, you are still the best thing that ever happened to me. She kissed him then, not caring who saw, because some things were too important to hide. When they finally pulled apart, she saw their children watching them with expressions that ranged from Matthew's embarrassment to Sarah's delight. You two are ridiculous, Elizabeth said, but she was smiling. Your father has always been ridiculous, Natalie agreed. It is one of his most endearing qualities. As the social continued around them, Natalie looked at her family, at the life they had built, and felt profound gratitude. She thought about the woman she had been 10 years ago, lonely and struggling, baking pies just to survive. She thought about the moment James Everett had walked into her life and changed everything with a ridiculous gesture and an honest heart. She thought about how close she had come to saying no to that first dinner invitation, how fear had almost kept her from taking the risk. And she was grateful beyond words that she had been brave enough to say yes. The years continued to pass, bringing new challenges and new joys. Matthew grew up and started his own carpentry business, working alongside his father but developing his own style and clientele. Elizabeth opened her own bakery in the next town over, expanding the family business in new directions. Joshua surprised everyone by becoming a teacher, taking a position at the schoolhouse his father had helped furnish all those years ago. Sarah, the baby, remained a free spirit, helping in the bakery when she felt like it but mostly focused on her horses and her dreams of exploring beyond New Mexico. James and Natalie grew older together, their hair turning gray, their bodies bearing the marks of years of hard work. But their love never diminished. If anything, it grew deeper, richer, tempered by time and trial into something unbreakable. On their 20th anniversary, James surprised her by recreating their first date. He took her to the hotel restaurant, which had been renovated and expanded but still occupied the same building. They ordered pot roast and potatoes, just like they had that first night, and talked about everything and nothing while the world moved around them. 20 years, Natalie said, marveling at how fast the time had gone. Sometimes it feels like just yesterday you bought all my pies. And sometimes it feels like I have loved you forever, James replied. Like I cannot remember a time when you were not the center of my world. That is because you have a terrible memory. Only for things that do not matter. I remember every important moment. The first time I saw you at the social, looking so fierce and determined. The first time you laughed at one of my jokes. The first time you told me you loved me. The day we got married. The births of our children. Every moment matters, and I remember them all. Natalie reached across the table and took his hand, feeling the familiar calluses, the strength that remained despite the years. I am glad you bought my pies. So am I, though I still maintain they were delicious enough to justify the expense. $33 for 12 pies was highway robbery. It was an investment in our future, and look how well it paid off. They finished their meal in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that only comes from years of knowing someone so completely that words become optional. When they left the restaurant and walked home through the quiet streets of White Oaks, Natalie thought about how much the town had changed since she was young. It was bigger now, more prosperous, with actual streets instead of dirt paths and street lamps that made the night less dark. But some things remained the same. The church still stood at the end of town, its bell ringing every Sunday morning. The Morrison Ranch still operated, though under new ownership after Samuel Morrison retired and moved to Santa Fe. The general store where Natalie had bought supplies on credit still served the community, now run by Mrs. Henderson's daughter. And at the heart of it all, Natalie and James remained, constants in a changing world, proof that love and determination and the willingness to take risks could build something lasting. When Natalie was 60 years old, she finally closed her bakery. Her hands had developed arthritis that made the constant work painful, and she decided it was time to slow down. She still baked at home, teaching her grandchildren the same skills she had learned from her mother, but the daily grind of running a business was behind her. James had already retired from carpentry, passing his workshop over to Matthew while he focused on smaller projects and spending time with family. They became the kind of grandparents who spoiled their grandchildren shamelessly, who told stories about the old days that probably got more dramatic with each retelling, who modeled what a long, happy marriage looked like. On their 40th anniversary, their children threw them a party at the church. Half the town showed up, 3 generations of people whose lives had been touched by James's carpentry or Natalie's baking, or simply their example of steady love and hard work. There were speeches and toasts and more food than anyone could possibly eat. But the moment Natalie treasured most came when James pulled her aside, away from the crowd, and led her to the spot where he had first approached her table all those years ago. 40 years, he said. 40 years since I made the best decision of my life. I think we have done all right, Natalie agreed, better than all right. We have built something beautiful, a family, a life, a legacy. He pulled her close, and they swayed together to music only they could hear. If I could go back and tell that young cowboy what buying those pies would lead to, he would never believe me. If I could go back and tell that scared young woman that everything would be all right, that she would find love and happiness and security, she would never believe me either. Then I suppose it is good we did not know. We just had to take it one day at a time and trust that we were heading in the right direction. Natalie rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat, steady and strong despite his age. I would not change anything. Not the hard times, not the struggles, not any of it, because it led us here. Neither would I. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other while the party continued around them, 2 people who had found each other against the odds and built a life worth living. The years continued to pass, inevitable as the turning of seasons. James's health began to fail when he was in his early 70s, his heart growing weaker despite his stubborn refusal to slow down. The doctors said there was nothing they could do, that he had lived a long, full life, and now his body was simply wearing out. Natalie refused to accept it at first. She had overcome so many obstacles, had fought so hard for everything she had, that the idea of losing James to something as simple as age felt wrong. But as the months passed and he grew weaker, she had to face reality. On a warm spring evening, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, James Everett passed away peacefully in the bed he had shared with Natalie for over 50 years. His last words were to her, whispered so softly that only she could hear. "Thank you for the best life I could have asked for. Thank you for saying yes. I love you." Natalie held him as he slipped away, her tears falling on his still face, her heart breaking in ways she had not thought possible. After he was gone and the children were making arrangements, she sat alone in their kitchen and thought about the man she had loved for more than half her life. She thought about a young cowboy who had walked up to her table at a church social and bought every pie she had. She thought about honest brown eyes and calloused hands and a smile that had made her believe in possibilities again. She thought about the life they had built together, the family they had raised, the love that had sustained them through every challenge. And she knew that even though the pain of losing him was almost unbearable, she would not trade a single moment of their time together. Because loving James Everett, being loved by him, had been the great privilege of her life. She continued living in the house he had built for another 5 years, surrounded by children and grandchildren who made sure she was never alone. She still baked occasionally, though her hands were not as steady as they once were. She told stories about James to anyone who would listen, keeping his memory alive through words and love, and the legacy they had created together. On a crisp October morning, Natalie Abbott Everett died peacefully in her sleep, a smile on her face, one hand clutching the ring James had given her over 50 years earlier. Her children found her like that, looking peaceful and younger somehow, as if death had lifted the weight of years and sorrow. They buried her next to James in the White Oak Cemetery, under a tree that provided shade in the summer and shelter in the winter. The whole town turned out for the funeral, 3 generations of people whose lives had been enriched by knowing her. They spoke about her kindness, her determination, her incredible pies, and the love story that had become legend in White Oaks. Elizabeth, standing at her mother's grave, thought about the story she had heard all her life, about how her father had bought every pie her mother baked at a church social, about how that ridiculous gesture had started a courtship that became a marriage, that became a family, that became a legacy. They were quite a pair, Matthew said quietly, standing beside his sister. They were, Elizabeth agreed. I hope I can love someone as completely as they loved each other. I think we all do, Joshua added. They set an impossible standard. Not impossible, Sarah said, the youngest and always the romantic. They proved it was possible. They showed us what real love looks like. We just have to be brave enough to reach for it the way they did. As the family stood together around their parents' graves, the sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light across the cemetery. And if you believed in such things, you might imagine 2 souls reunited at last, walking hand in hand toward whatever came next, their love story complete but never truly ending. Because the best stories, the truest love, never really dies. It lives on in the people left behind, in the lessons learned and the examples set, in the grandchildren who bake pies and build furniture and fall in love with the same determination their grandparents showed. In White Oaks, New Mexico, people still talk about Natalie and James Everett. They talk about the church social where it all began, about the cowboy who bought every pie and won a heart in the process, about a love that lasted through decades of joy and hardship and everything in between. And sometimes, on warm summer evenings, you can smell fresh baked pie on the breeze, as if the spirit of Natalie Everett is still baking, still sharing the gift that started everything. The church still holds socials and people still bake pies and young couples still find each other in unexpected ways, because that is what love does. It endures, it inspires, it becomes legend. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, a cowboy and a pie maker are walking hand in hand, their love as fresh and new and eternal as it was that first day when he walked up to her table and changed both their lives forever with 12 pies and $33, and the courage to take a chance on something beautiful.